I was about to sit at the dinner table. My stepmother pushed my chair away. A military woman doesn't belong in this family. The room went silent. My stepbrother started recording. I stood up and smiled. You just made the biggest mistake of your life. My name is Sarah, and I'm a major. That night, the night my stepmother tried to humiliate me in front of my entire family, was the night she made the biggest mistake of her life. I'd just landed after an 8-month deployment. My uniform still smelled like the transport plane. My hands still remembered the weight of goodbyes I'd said to people who wouldn't be coming home. All I wanted was one quiet dinner with my family. I didn't get one because the moment I reached for my chair, my stepmother pulled it away in front of everyone and said the words that would end our family as we'd all pretended it was. The room went silent. My father stared at his plate. My stepbrother pulled out his phone and started recording, laughing under his breath. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I stood up. I smiled. And I said, "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." She had no idea what was coming. Let me take you back, because none of this makes sense without the years underneath it. My mother died when I was 12. It was cancer, and it was slow. The kind of slow that gives you time to prepare and somehow prepares you for nothing at all. I remember the hospital room more clearly than most of my childhood before it. The beeping monitors, the gray afternoon light through the blinds, my father sitting in a plastic chair holding her hand like if he let go she'd slip away faster. When she finally died, I watched my father fall apart in ways I never told anyone about. He stopped cooking. He stopped answering the phone unless it was work. Some nights I'd hear him in the kitchen at 2 in the morning, not crying exactly, just sitting there in the dark like silence was the only thing that made sense anymore. I was 12 and didn't know how to fix that, so I did the only thing I could think of. I got quiet too. I learned to need less, to take up less space in a house that already felt too big for the two of us. 2 years later, he married Diane. I want to be fair to my father here, because I've spent a long time being angry at him and I don't think all of it was earned. He was a man drowning, and Diane threw him something that looked like a life raft. She was warm in the way he needed someone to be warm. She laughed easily, filled the silence in our house with noise, dinner parties, music. I understand now why he reached for that, and why he didn't look too closely at what came with it. What came with it was Kyle, 3 years older than me, with a smile that never once reached his eyes when he looked in my direction. And Diane herself, who was warm to everyone in the world except, I would come to learn, me. It didn't happen all at once. That's the thing people don't understand about this kind of erosion. It's not a single cruel moment you can point to. It's quieter than that. It's family photos rearranged so Kyle is centered and I'm at the edge, half cut off by the frame. It's my name left off the holiday card list one year, and Diane's face going carefully blank when I mentioned it, like I was the one being difficult for noticing. It's Kyle getting the bigger bedroom, the one with the window seat I used to read in, because Diane decided the arrangement made more sense that way. It's Kyle getting the newer car when we both turned 16, while I got the one with the temperamental heater, because Diane said Kyle needed something reliable, and I was, in her words, more resourceful. It's the college fund my mother had set aside for me before she died. Small money built up over years of cut corners I didn't understand until I was old enough to do the math myself. Somehow, it got folded into the family finances Diane managed, and somehow, when college came, most of it had gone toward things that weren't me. I never told my father any of it. He'd already lost so much, and I didn't want to be the thing that knocked the air back out of him, so I carried it myself. It's a skill that would come in useful later, though I didn't know that yet. By 17, I'd stopped expecting Diane to treat me like her own. What I hadn't stopped doing was looking for a way out, something mine, something no one could quietly rearrange or fold into someone else's finances. I found it in a recruiter's office 3 weeks after graduation. I joined the military at 18. People assume that was about running away, and maybe a small part of it was, but mostly it was about building something. Rank I earned through work no one could dispute. A life where the rules were written down, where you knew exactly what it took to earn something, and nobody could take it away because your face didn't fit the family photo the way they wanted. 12 years later, I was a major. I had led soldiers through deployments most people can't imagine, the kind that live in your chest long after you're home. I had earned every insignia on my uniform the hard way, through years of work that had nothing to do with whose name was on a holiday card. And still, walking into that house for Sunday dinner, I was just the stepdaughter who thinks she's better than us. I should have known that dinner would be different from the others. I just didn't know how different. The plan, as much as there was one, started with a phone call 2 weeks earlier. My father's voice on the line, thinner than I remembered, the kind of thin that made my stomach tighten before he'd even said anything specific. "Sarah," he said, "please, just come home. One dinner. That's all I'm asking." I almost said no. Diane's messages to me over the years had always been technically polite and somehow still cold, ice-wrapped in cursive handwriting. "Happy birthday. Hope work is going well. We'd love to see you sometime," sent in a tone that made clear sometime meant never. But it was my father asking. And some part of me, even after 12 years of building a life 2,000 miles from that house, still wanted to believe there was a version of that family where I belonged at the table without having to fight for it. So I flew back. I wore my dress uniform, not to make a point, but because I'd come straight from an awards ceremony on base and hadn't had time to change before my flight. I remember thinking on the plane, maybe this time will be different. Maybe Diane has softened. Maybe Kyle has grown up. I was wrong on every count, and some part of me knew it even as I hoped otherwise. Hope has a way of surviving evidence it shouldn't survive. When I walked in, Diane's eyes swept over my uniform with something between disgust and satisfaction, like she'd been handed a weapon and didn't even have to load it herself. "Well," she said, loud enough for the whole room, the kind of loud that's really meant for an audience, "look who decided to grace us with her presence. Dressed for war, I see." I let it go. I'd learned, over 12 years and honestly longer than that, how to let things go. It's a survival skill you develop early in a house like the one I grew up in, and it turns out to be useful in a lot of other contexts too. Deployments, briefings, rooms full of people who outrank you and are wrong about something important. Dinner started normal enough, or at least normal by that house's standards. Small talk about the flight, the weather, nothing that mattered. Kyle bragged about a promotion at a job Diane had gotten him through a friend from the country club, the kind that comes with a title but not much else, so he talked about it like he'd built something from nothing. My father sat mostly quiet, watching me the way you watch something fragile you're afraid to touch wrong. Then I reached for my chair. Diane pulled it away. The chair scraped against the hardwood floor, a sound that hung in the air longer than it should have. For one confused second, I genuinely thought it was an accident. Then I saw her face. There was nothing accidental in it. It was deliberate, almost amused, the expression of someone who had been waiting for this specific moment and was savoring the fact that it had finally arrived. A military woman doesn't belong in this family, she said. Sit somewhere else. Or better yet, don't sit at all. Silence dropped over that room like a blanket thrown over a fire, the kind that doesn't put it out so much as smother the light so you can't see how badly it's still burning underneath. My father opened his mouth, and I watched him close it again without a word. 12 years of silence had trained him well, better than either of us wanted to admit. Kyle laughed. He actually laughed, a short, ugly bark, and then he pulled out his phone and started filming, angling it up at me like he was capturing something he'd waited years to see. "This is going straight online," he said, grinning at me the way he used to grin when he'd gotten away with something as a teenager. "Wait till everyone sees the big, tough soldier get put in her place." I felt something rise in my chest, and it surprised me, because it wasn't the anger you'd expect. It was colder, sharper. The same focus I used to feel in the seconds before a mission briefing, when every unnecessary thought falls away and only the plan is left. I looked at Diane. I mean, really looked at her, in a way I don't think I ever had before. 12 years of small cruelties, the rearranged photos, the name left off the card, the room, the car, the fund that should have been mine. All of it sitting behind her eyes, daring me to break, daring me to prove her right about exactly the kind of person she'd always wanted me to be. I didn't break. I stood up slowly. I straightened my jacket, the way I would before stepping into a room full of people who needed to see someone in control. I let the silence stretch, long enough that even Kyle's laughter died out, long enough that the only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator, absurdly ordinary against everything else happening in that moment, and I smiled. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life," I said. My voice was calm, still water calm, the kind I'd trained into myself over more deployments than I could easily count, the kind that unsettles people more than shouting ever could. Diane rolled her eyes, but I saw something flicker underneath the performance of it, something that hadn't quite decided yet whether to be worried. "Oh, please," she said. "What are you going to do, Major? Deploy against me?" I didn't answer right away. I just picked up my phone from where I'd set it beside my plate, sent one short text, and sat back down in a different chair, one I'd pulled up myself from against the wall. "Finish your dinner," I told her. "You're going to want your strength for tomorrow." Here's what Diane didn't know sitting across that table from me, still riding the high of a moment she thought she'd won. What none of them knew. Not Diane, not Kyle, not even my father. Not yet. The text I'd just sent didn't go to a friend or to some dramatic threat I was making up on the spot to save face. It went to my lawyer. It said one word: tomorrow. To understand why that word meant what it meant, why a single word could sit there on a phone screen and quietly end everything Diane thought she had built, you have to go back 6 months to a phone call I got on a Tuesday afternoon while I was between briefings on base, a call I almost didn't answer because I was in the middle of something that felt urgent at the time and turned out to be nothing compared to what was waiting on the other end of that line. It was my father, not Diane, not Kyle. My father, calling my direct line instead of the family group chat he usually used, which should have told me something before he even said a word. "Sarah," he said, and there was something in his voice I hadn't heard in years, something that sounded almost like the version of him from right after my mother died, thin and uncertain in a way that made my chest tighten before he'd explained anything. "Dad, what's wrong? I need your help with something," he said, "and I need you to not tell Diane I called." I sat down on the edge of my bunk, phone pressed hard against my ear, already feeling the particular kind of cold that comes before you know exactly what's wrong, but you know it's something. "Okay," I said. "I'm listening." He told me about the diagnosis first. Early heart trouble. Nothing that would kill him tomorrow, but the kind of thing that required a procedure, medication, careful monitoring, the kind of diagnosis that reminds a person of their own mortality in a way that makes them want someone else to carry some of the weight for a while. He told me Diane had offered to manage his medical decisions and his finances while he recovered, so he wouldn't have to worry about paperwork on top of everything else. "That sounds reasonable," I said carefully, even though something in me was already bracing. "It did to me too," he said. "But Sarah, I don't remember signing some of these things. I found a document in the file cabinet last week. Power of attorney. My signature's on it, but I don't remember the day. I don't remember a lawyer being in the room. I was on medication after the procedure, and I think maybe I signed something I shouldn't have." I closed my eyes. 12 years of small erasures came rushing back all at once. The photos, the fund, the years of watching Diane manage things in ways that always seemed to benefit exactly one person in that house. I'd spent so long telling myself I was being unfair, that I was still a hurt teenager holding a grudge against a woman who'd simply never learned to love a child that wasn't hers. But this was different. This wasn't about warmth or its absence. This was about money and paperwork and a signature my father genuinely could not remember giving. "Dad," I said, "I want you to send me everything you have. Every statement, every document, anything with your signature on it from the last year. Can you do that without Diane knowing?" There was a long pause on the line, long enough enough that I thought maybe he was going to change his mind, retreat back into the same silence that had protected him and hurt me for over a decade. But when he spoke again, his voice had steadied, just slightly. "Yes," he said, "I can do that. That was 6 months ago." That phone call was the beginning of something I'd been building quietly ever since. Piece by piece, document by document, while smiling through holiday dinners and birthday calls and every ordinary moment that Diane had no idea was actually evidence gathering. I hadn't planned to confront her at a dinner table in front of Kyle's phone camera. That wasn't the plan at all. The plan had been careful, quiet, designed to protect my father's dignity above everything else. To let Diane walk away with her name simply removed from every account. No scandal, no public unraveling. Nothing that would embarrass a man who had already been embarrassed enough by trusting the wrong person with what remained of his life. But she'd pulled my chair away and put her cruelty on camera for the world to see, and something in me had recalibrated in real time, standing there in that dining room. The quiet plan was still the plan, but there was no reason anymore to protect her feelings about how it happened. "Tomorrow," the text said. And tomorrow, my lawyer and the financial advisor who had quietly become an ally in all of this, and 6 months of careful documentation were all going to converge on a house that Diane thought was still entirely under her control. She had no idea how much ground had already shifted underneath her while she sat there rolling her eyes at me across a dinner table she thought she'd just won. The documents my father sent me over the following weeks arrived in pieces, photographed on his phone and emailed to an account Diane didn't know I'd set up specifically for this. A small precaution that felt paranoid until it turned out to be exactly necessary. The first thing I noticed was the pattern. Money doesn't disappear all at once when someone's being careful about it. It disappears in amounts small enough to look ordinary, timed in ways that don't draw attention, spread across enough transactions that no single one of them looks like anything worth questioning. I'd spent enough time around logistics and supply chains in my career to recognize a pattern when I saw one, even outside the context I was used to seeing them in. This was a pattern. Withdrawals from his retirement account, always just under the amount that would trigger additional bank scrutiny. A transfer here, described in the records as household expenses, that didn't match up with anything I could find in the actual household. A recurring payment to an account I didn't recognize, one that, when I finally traced it weeks later, turned out to belong to Kyle. I want to be honest about how that felt, seeing Kyle's name attached to money quietly pulled from my father's retirement fund. It wasn't surprise, not really. It was more like watching a shape you'd suspected for years finally resolve into something you could actually point to and name. I'd spent 12 years telling myself I might be imagining the favoritism, the small cruelties, the sense that I was tolerated in that house while Kyle was cherished. Here it was, in black and white, in dollar amounts and dates. It hadn't been my imagination. It had been happening the entire time, and it had simply gotten worse, more literal, once my father's health made him vulnerable enough that no one was checking closely. The power of attorney document was the piece that mattered most, and it was also the piece that made me the angriest, in a slow, cold way that took a long time to burn off. I had a friend from law school, someone I'd known since before either of us had a career, review it for me without telling her whose family it belonged to. She called me back within a day. "This is dated the same day as his procedure," she said. "Sarah, if he was under anesthesia or heavily medicated when this was signed and there's no independent witness, no lawyer of his own present, this could be challenged. This could potentially be invalidated entirely." What would that mean? It would mean whoever's been acting on his behalf using this document has been doing so without valid legal authority. Depending on what they've done with that authority, that could mean a lot of things. Some of them criminal. I sat with that for a long time after we hung up. Criminal wasn't a word I'd let myself think yet. Not fully, even though some part of me had known from the first phone call that this was heading somewhere serious. There's a difference between suspecting something and having a lawyer say the word criminal about your stepmother, a difference that sat in my chest for days afterward. I flew out to see my father under the cover of a routine visit, the kind of trip that wouldn't raise questions, timed for a weekend when Diane had a standing commitment with friends from the club that would keep her out of the house for several hours. I sat with him at the kitchen table, the same table where, months later, that dinner would happen, and I laid out what I'd found so far. He didn't say much while I talked. He just sat there, getting older in front of me in a way that had nothing to do with actual time passing. His hands folded on the table, his eyes moving over documents he half remembered signing and half didn't remember at all. "I trusted her," he said finally, quietly, like the words cost him something to say out loud. "I know. I trusted her with you too," he said, and that was the moment something in his voice cracked, just slightly, just enough that I understood he wasn't only talking about money anymore. I should have paid more attention to how she was with you. I told myself I was seeing things that weren't there. I didn't say anything for a moment because I didn't trust my voice not to crack too. 12 years of not telling him, of carrying things myself so he wouldn't have one more weight to carry. And here he was, finally seeing some version of it on his own, without me having to say a word. "We'll deal with the money first," I said eventually. "That's what we can prove right now. The rest we can talk about when you're ready. And if she finds out what we're doing before we're ready," that was the question that had been sitting underneath everything since that first phone call. I didn't have a clean answer for it yet. What I had was a growing case, a lawyer, a financial advisor I was slowly working to bring onto our side, and a father who was finally, after 12 years, starting to ask the right questions about the woman he'd let manage so much of his life. "Then we adjust," I told him, "but we don't stop." By the time I flew back to base that weekend, I believed I understood the full shape of what Diane had done. 6 months of documents, one procedure, one moment of vulnerability she'd exploited while my father recovered. A single power of attorney signed under medication, used to redirect money over half a year. It felt contained. Ugly, but contained. The kind of thing that could be undone with enough patience and the right paperwork. I had no idea yet how wrong that picture was. The financial advisor's name doesn't matter for this story. But what matters is that Diane thought he was loyal to her, and for a while he was, or at least he was, neutral enough that it amounted to the same thing. He'd been managing my father's accounts for years, and Diane had made herself the primary point of contact for anything related to them once my father's health made that arrangement seem sensible. I reached out to him carefully, framing my first message as a routine question a concerned daughter might ask about her father's retirement planning. Nothing that would set off alarms. He answered politely, professionally, the kind of response that gives you nothing and also confirms nothing is being deliberately hidden from a basic inquiry. It took 3 more conversations, spread out over several weeks, before I felt like I understood what kind of person he actually was underneath the professional caution. He wasn't corrupt. That was the thing I needed to figure out before I could decide how honest to be with him. He wasn't in on whatever Diane had been doing. He was, as far as I could tell, simply someone who had been given a role, primary contact, trusted intermediary, and had performed that role without asking the kinds of questions that might have caught this earlier. I told him the truth on our 4th conversation, sitting in a rental car in a parking lot outside base because I didn't trust the connection at home, not to have someone walk in at the wrong moment. I told him about the power of attorney, the timing of it, my father's memory gap around signing it. I told him about the pattern of withdrawals, the transfers I couldn't account for, the recurring payment that traced back to Kyle. There was a long silence on the line after I finished. I need to pull some records, he said finally, his voice different now, careful in a new way, the caution of someone who has just realized he might have been an unwitting part of something he wouldn't have agreed to if he'd understood it clearly. Give me a few days. He called back 5 days later, and by then his voice had changed again, harder this time, the voice of someone who had looked closely at something and didn't like what he found. There are transfers I approved based on instructions I received from Diane, acting under the authority of that power of attorney, he said. If that document isn't valid, if your father wasn't competent to sign it or wasn't properly represented when he did, then I authorized transactions I shouldn't have. I need to be very careful about how I handle this from here, both for your father's protection and, frankly, for my own liability. Would you be willing to cooperate with a formal investigation? I asked. Provide the records, explain what instructions you were given and when. Another pause, shorter this time. Yes, he said, I would. That was the piece that turned 6 months of quiet documentation into something that could actually move forward. A cooperating witness with direct financial records, time-stamped, official, the kind of evidence that doesn't depend on memory or interpretation. Combined with what my lawyer friend had already flagged about the power of attorney document itself, and my father's own account of not remembering signing it, we had something that could survive scrutiny. My lawyer, an actual retained lawyer at this point, not just a friend doing me a favor between her own cases, laid it out for me plainly during one of our calls. You have a strong civil case for financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, she said. Given his diagnosis and medication at the time the power of attorney was signed, there's also a real possibility of criminal charges, depending on how aggressively you want to pursue this and what your father is comfortable with. The document itself can likely be invalidated. Every transfer made under its authority becomes recoverable. What does recoverable mean in practice? It means we can go after the money. All of it if we can trace it, which based on what you've given me, we largely can. I remember sitting with that information for a long time after the call ended, turning it over, thinking about what it would actually mean to do this, to take everything I found and turn it into something formal, something that would end with Diane facing real consequences instead of just quietly losing access to accounts she'd been misusing. Some part of me, and I want to be honest about this because it's part of what happened next, some part of me hesitated, not because I doubted what I'd found. I didn't doubt any of it. I hesitated because doing this fully, formally, publicly, if it came to that, meant blowing up whatever remained of the fragile family structure my father had built after my mother died. It meant Kyle facing consequences too. Kyle, who I'd grown up resenting, but who was also, underneath everything, a person whose life this would upend. For about 2 weeks, I actually considered a smaller version of this, quietly getting the power of attorney revoked, quietly getting Diane's name off the accounts, letting the money that had already moved simply stay moved, calling it a loss and moving forward without the fight. I told myself this would be the mature thing to do, the thing that protected my father from having to watch his wife face criminal exposure, the thing that spared everyone the mess of what full accountability would actually look like. I even drafted an email to my lawyer outlining that smaller approach. I sat with it in my drafts folder for 4 days before I finally deleted it without sending it. What changed my mind wasn't a single dramatic realization. It was smaller than that, and it happened slowly, the same way the original erosion of my place in that family had happened slowly. One quiet moment layering onto the next until the shape of something became impossible to ignore. What pushed me back toward the full version of this, the version I'd almost talked myself out of, started with a phone call from my father that had nothing to do with money at all. It was a Sunday evening, about a month before that dinner, and he called just to talk, the way he sometimes did now that we were speaking more often than we had in years. We talked about nothing important for a while. Then, almost as an aside, he mentioned that Diane had brought up my mother that week. She said something strange, she told me. We were going through some old boxes in the garage, and Diane found a photo of your mother, one from before we were married, and she said, "It's good you finally have a real family now." I sat very still still, waiting for him to explain that he'd corrected her, that he'd said something about how my mother was part of our real family too. What did you say? I asked when he didn't continue. I didn't say anything, he admitted, and I could hear that he understood exactly what that silence meant. I just put the photo back in the box. It was such a small thing. A comment in a garage, a photo returned to a box, a silence that lasted maybe 3 seconds before the conversation moved on. In isolation, it would have been easy to let go. Exactly the kind of thing I'd learned to let go of my entire life. But I wasn't in isolation anymore. I had 6 months of documents, a financial advisor's cooperation, a lawyer's assessment of a strong case, and now this. A small, unremarkable comment that made something in me go very quiet and very clear. It's good you finally have a real family now. I thought about the version of accountability I'd been considering. The quiet version. The one where Diane's name simply comes off the accounts and the money that's already moved stays moved and nobody has to face anything harder than an awkward conversation about financial planning going forward. That version would communicate that what she'd done was survivable without real cost. That the years of small erasures, culminating in years of quietly redirecting money from a man who trusted her while she called herself his real family, could happen, and the consequence would simply be a polite adjustment to some paperwork. I'd already deleted the drafted email outlining the smaller approach days earlier, but even having written it at all now felt like something I needed to reckon with. A version of myself that had been ready to let this go smaller and quieter than it deserved. The same way I'd let so many smaller things go for 12 years because I didn't want to be the one causing trouble. I called my lawyer back the next morning. I want to move forward with everything, I told her. Full documentation, the financial advisor's cooperation, all of it. I'm not looking to spare her from consequences anymore. What changed? She asked, and I could tell she genuinely wanted to know. I told her about the photo in the garage. I told her about 12 years of small moments that had taught me to expect less, to be grateful for whatever scraps of belonging I was allowed. I told her that I'd almost let this become one more thing I quietly absorbed so nobody else would have to feel uncomfortable, and that I'd finally understood sitting with that phone call that absorbing it would just be one more version of the exact pattern that had let this happen in the first place. Okay, she said, then let's build this properly. I want everything documented, time-stamped, ready to move the moment you tell me to move. That was 3 weeks before the dinner. In those 3 weeks, the case went from something theoretical, something I could still imagine walking away from, into something concrete and ready. Sitting in a folder my lawyer kept locked and backed up, waiting for a word from me. I didn't know, when I flew home for that dinner, that Diane was going to hand me the reason to send that word herself. I'd assumed the confrontation would happen on my terms, in a controlled setting, probably in my lawyer's office with everyone calm and everything procedural. I hadn't planned on a dining room, a pulled chair, a phone camera, and Kyle's lap, but sitting there after she said don't sit at all, after Kyle said this is going straight online, I understood that the careful, controlled version wasn't going to be necessary anymore. She'd handed me a room full of witnesses to exactly the kind of person she was. At the precise moment, I had a folder ready to show them exactly what that kind of person had been doing. I sent the text, tomorrow. And for the rest of that dinner, I ate calmly, answered small talk politely, and watched Diane enjoy a victory that was already, unbeknownst to her, the last one she was going to get. By the next morning, 2 things were already moving at once. Kyle's video, the one he'd proudly posted showing a soldier put in her place, had started getting attention, though not the kind he wanted. Veterans, active duty service members, and total strangers began filling the comments, not mocking me, but tearing into Diane and Kyle for what they'd done. It spread faster than either of them could control. By early afternoon, Kyle had quietly deleted it, but the screenshots were already everywhere, saved and reposted by people who wanted the record to stay public. Second, and far more important than anything happening online, my father sat down with the folder I handed him at his kitchen table. Bank statements, the power of attorney document with a signature he genuinely couldn't place. A timeline stretching back over a year, laid out in dates and dollar amounts that didn't leave much room for interpretation. I watched something break in his face as he understood, fully and finally, what had been happening in his own house while he trusted the person managing it. Sarah, he said quietly, is this real? I wouldn't show you if it wasn't. He called Diane into the room himself. I stayed standing near the door, still in my uniform from the ceremony 2 days earlier, because it felt important to be exactly what she'd insulted while she faced what she'd actually done. Diane's face moved through every stage as my father spoke. Confusion first, then denial, then something sharper. When he told her, in a voice steadier than I'd heard from him in years, that the accounts were being frozen and a lawyer would be reviewing everything, she turned on me instead of him. You planned this, she hissed. You waited for this. No, I said. You handed it to me. I just made sure the truth had somewhere to go. She started talking fast then, the way people do when the ground is moving under them faster than their explanations can keep up. It was for the family, she said. Kyle needed help getting on his feet. My father would have wanted to help his stepson too if he'd been asked properly, and she'd only been managing things the way she always had, the way that had always kept the household running. My father listened to all of it with an expression I hadn't seen on him before. Something that had finally, after 12 years, stopped giving her the benefit of the doubt. You forged consent for a document you knew I wasn't in a state to actually agree to, he said. That's not managing things. That's not what marriage means. It was in the middle of that exchange, while Diane was still trying to reframe a year of quiet transfers as ordinary household management, that my lawyer called with the piece of information that changed the entire shape of what we were dealing with. Sarah, I need you to hear this before anyone else does, my lawyer said, and something in her voice made made me step out of the kitchen and into the hallway, phone pressed hard to my ear. The financial advisor pulled a second set of records overnight, she continued. Older ones from before your father's diagnosis. Sarah, this didn't start 6 months ago. There's a second power of attorney document, an earlier one, dated almost 3 years back. Different wording, less obviously irregular on its surface, easy to miss if you weren't looking for exactly this pattern. But it's there, and there are transfers going back to that date. Years of them, not months. I stood very still in that hallway, the sound of my father's voice and Diane's still audible through the kitchen doorway, and felt the entire shape of what I thought I understood rearrange itself. 3 years, I said. 3 years. And Sarah, the amounts. Once we widened the window, the total is significantly larger than what we'd calculated based on the recent activity alone. We're not talking about tens of thousands anymore. She told me the number. I won't put it here because it isn't really the point, but it was large enough that I had to lean against the wall for a moment. Large enough that it explained things I hadn't even thought to question yet. Why certain renovations had happened on the house years ago that Diane always credited to her own savings. Why Kyle had never seemed to struggle financially despite a series of jobs that never lasted and never paid particularly well. Why my father, a careful man his whole life, had somehow never quite managed to build the retirement cushion he used to talk about wanting. It hadn't been a year of opportunistic transfers taken after a health scare made him vulnerable. It had been 3 years of a slow, careful, patient siphoning, one that had started long before any diagnosis, one that Diane had simply accelerated once his health gave her an easier cover story for controlling the finances more completely. I walked back into the kitchen. My father looked up at my face, and whatever he saw there made him go pale before I'd said a word. What? He said. What is it? I told him. The earlier document, the 3 years, the number my lawyer had just given me. I watched him do the same thing I'd just done in the hallway, recalculating everything he thought he understood about the last several years of his own life. Diane didn't deny it this time. That told me, more than anything else in that kitchen, how thoroughly this had been planned rather than opportunistically improvised. She didn't look confused, the way someone does when they're caught in something they didn't realize the scope of. She looked for just a moment before she composed her face again, almost relieved, like a performance she'd been maintaining for 3 years had finally been allowed to stop. You have no idea what it's like, she said quietly. Not to me, to my father. Being the one who has to manage everything while everyone else gets to just live their lives. I kept this family running. I was owed something for that. Owed, my father repeated, and I heard something in his voice I'd never heard directed at her before. Something final. You were my wife, not an employee I forgot to pay. He asked her to leave the house that afternoon. Not through screaming, just a quiet, exhausted request that she pack what belonged to her and go, that the rest would be handled through lawyers from that point forward. Kyle, listening from the doorway, said nothing at all. There was nothing left for him to say that wouldn't have made things worse. 3 years, it turned out, was long enough to build something that looked from the outside exactly like a family. It was also long enough, once someone finally started looking closely, to trace every dollar and every lie that had actually been holding that appearance together. Diane didn't go to prison. My father couldn't bring himself to press full criminal charges against a woman he'd shared a home with for over a decade. I understood that, even when part of me wanted more for him than that mercy cost him. Every dollar that could be traced was traced. The invalid power of attorney made every transfer under its authority recoverable, exactly as my lawyer had told me months earlier. Diane's name came off every account. What remained came back, and what had already been spent became part of a settlement she agreed to, rather than risk the criminal referral my father was still holding as leverage. She packed her things within the week and moved into an apartment across town. Kyle tried, briefly, to paint himself as the victim online, posting about a family torn apart by a sister with a grudge. It didn't land, and he lost the job Diane had arranged for him not long after. My father and I talked more in the following months than in the previous 12 years combined. He apologized more than once, really apologized. I should have said something the day she moved your things out of your old room, he told me once, his voice breaking in a way I'd only heard from him twice in my life, once at my mother's funeral and once in that kitchen with the folder open between us. I told myself I was protecting the family. I was protecting myself from having to feel how bad it actually was. I forgave him, not because it erased 12 years of small erasures or 3 years of money quietly disappearing while he looked the other way. I forgave him because holding on to that anger wouldn't have protected anyone, including me. It would have kept me standing at that dinner table forever, waiting for a chair that was never going to be pulled back in on its own. Looking back now, I don't think much about the chair itself, or even Kyle's phone held up, recording what he thought was going to be my humiliation. I think about how long I stayed quiet before that dinner, how many small cruelties I let slide for 12 years because I believed speaking up would break something that, it turned out, had already been broken for a long time. I think about how it took someone pulling a chair away from me in front of my entire family before I finally stood up, not just physically. For myself and for the 12-year-old girl who used to sit in a hospital room learning how to need less so she wouldn't be one more thing breaking her father. Here's what I learned. Cruelty says more about the person delivering it than the person receiving it. Diane spent 3 years trying to convince me, and eventually herself, that I didn't belong in that family. But it was never really about a chair or a name on a holiday card or even the money in the end. It was about her own need to control a family that was never fully hers to control. I didn't expose her because she insulted my uniform at a dinner table. I exposed her because the truth had been sitting quietly for 3 years, waiting for someone to finally go looking for it, and because some cruelty, left unanswered long enough, only grows into something larger and harder to undo. If someone ever pulls the chair out from under you, you, literally or otherwise, and tells you that you don't belong at your own table. I hope you remember this. Stand up. Don't shrink into whatever smaller shape they've decided is more comfortable for them. Don't beg for a seat that was always rightfully yours to begin with. Sometimes the smile you give them, right before you let the truth do the rest of the work, is the loudest answer you will ever need to give.